I am blown away, pleasantly surprised, and becoming more and more excited for Diablo 4 the more I hear about Diablo 4 systems, the intentions behind the game design from the devs, and also the, at least up to this point, transparency that the developers have offered to Diablo fans and collecting feedback to help shape and develop the game. With the recent betas as well as the developer livestream covering the endgame systems being no exception. And speaking of endgame systems, these are definitely going to be foundational for Diablo 4's success and replayability moving forward. And previously I had covered endgame activities extensively, which you can still check out in the description box below. But today we're going to be going over endgame progression systems such as itemization, as well as Paragon Boards and so forth. So with that, let's get right into it. So even after beating the main campaign and entering the so-called endgame of Diablo 4, and as with the previous Diablo games, leveling will continue to be an important part of endgame progression, seeing as not only do World Tiers 3 and 4, Nightmare and Torment difficulties respectively, actually recommend on their tooltip certain higher levels past level 50, with roughly level 50 being the benchmark supposedly that one completes the campaign. But also as the culminating challenge at the end of each Diablo 4 season will be a level 100 boss that supposedly will require a character of a similar or close enough level to defeat. Now, in terms of how exactly leveling up affects player power, first of all, in the beta, since monsters scale up as you level up, so too do the items that drop, more specifically the item power of the gear that drops as you level up. Next, after your skill tree caps out at level 50, in that you won't be getting any additional skill points after that. So instead of that, you'll be getting 4 Paragon points per level past level 50. And if you're wondering what exactly that is and how it's different from the skill tree, first of all, the Paragon system of Diablo 4 is significantly different from that of Diablo 3, where there wasn't really any significant choice involved, as you were just still getting more powerful as you leveled up, but didn't have to think about where you would distribute any of the points you were getting. In Diablo 4 though, with each of the 4 Paragon points that you receive from leveling up to having 200 Paragon points by reaching level 100, if we don't count potential other sources like Altars of Lilith or even renown rewards from completing the zones. These points can then each be spent on a tile on your Paragon board, with the tiles giving you passive bonuses that have varying strengths and effects as well, also depending on whether it's a common or magic or rare or legendary tile, with the higher rarity type of tile being fewer in number on each Paragon board, but of course granting more unique and powerful bonuses. And in addition to these 4 types of Paragon tiles that grant passive power-ups and bonuses, there are actually 2 other types of Paragon tiles, the first being gate tiles, which if you reach one at the end or at the side of your square Paragon board, you'll be able to then progress to the next Paragon board connected to that gate tile, so to speak, which is again at the end of one of your sides of your original Paragon board. Plus, before you connect to the next board, you can actually choose to rotate that board to see where you want to start approaching that new board and where you want to connect with it essentially. And how each of these mechanics supposedly add to additional player choice and decision making and customizability is that, again, each Paragon board will have limited numbers of, especially the rarer tiles, right? The rare and legendary tiles. And so if you want to utilize more of those types of, say, gameplay altering or stronger tiles, you might want to prioritize keeping on spending your, say, Paragon points in a more straight fashion to get to the next Paragon board as quickly as you can, while trying to capture as many, say, legendary tiles and or rare tiles as you can. Or alternatively, if your build happens to be able to capitalize better on, say, some of the magic tiles, the stats, the basic stats that you'll be getting from them, or you happen to roll some really good rare or legendary tiles on one specific Paragon board, you could then choose to spend a little bit more time and more points on that specific board instead of branching out to other boards. Now there's yet another type of Paragon tile and mechanic that comes with it called socket tiles. And these can actually, like the name implies, be socketed with so-called glyphs, which are actually items that drop that you can socket into your Paragon board that grant passive bonuses themselves and or augment the actual attributes granted by the Paragon tiles around the glyph where you have that socketed. And if we just look at some of the examples here, like the rare Conqueror on the right, for every 10 willpower from your tiles that you have invested within the certain range of this glyph that you have socketed on your board, you actually deal increased overpower damage. And from the other two examples here, both the magic glyph on the left and the middle rare glyph, we can see that another type of attribute that can spawn on these glyphs is to increase the potency of the purchase nodes within their range. And this is actually somewhat similar to a Path of Exile mechanic on their skill tree, but nonetheless offers some additional complexity and yet another type of item that is coveted and that you can find to further customize your characters. And in addition to that, these Paragon glyphs can also supposedly be leveled up, which will likely increase the radius of effect on your Paragon board and also probably increase some of the numerical values of the bonuses on them. And last we heard, these Paragon glyphs will primarily be leveled up by completing nightmare dungeons, which will definitely be a strong incentive to do them. So Diablo 4's itemization game definitely looks like it not only draws inspiration from its predecessors Diablo 3 and Diablo 2, but also attempts to iterate and sort of improve upon the system to appeal to a wide audience with enough ease of access while still retaining a certain level of complexity, depth, and customizability. And to summarize, the current item endgame looks to be to collect primarily rares with the most number of affixes and the best affixes for your respective specialization and class, while also trying to collect the suitable and also highest rolled legendary aspects to imbue onto those rares for, again, that specialization. Now, there's actually one additional item type and rarity that can definitely potentially compete with even the highest end rares imbued with the optimal legendary powers, and those are unique items, which are even rarer items compared to legendary items that come with specific set attributes and effects that only vary based on the numerical values of those rolls. And very notably, these uniques can include old fan favorites like the Grandfather or the Harlequin Crest, also known as a Shaco from Diablo 2, which also looks like it grants a lot of similar attributes as it did back in Diablo 2, as also one of the best items from that game. So I'm extremely excited that unique items are making a return, and by the way, they do unlock at Nightmare difficulty, with again more being unlocked at the highest difficulty, which is Torment difficulty. And speaking of which, sacred items also begin to drop at World Tier 3, which is again Nightmare, and then Ancestral items will begin to drop at World Tier 4, which is Torment difficulty. And so previously I had briefly mentioned that items and monster levels will scale up with your character, but that is only mainly true up to level 50 for the first couple of world tiers. As you reach Nightmare difficulty, even though any item that drops supposedly can still be used by your character regardless of its level, it can actually range in power now, being a sacred item. It's defined as being an item that ranges between being viable for a character from anywhere between level 50 to level 70. So it'll have a set power still, but it'll be either on the higher or lower end, right? So the best sacred item would be a level 70 item power type item, which you can still get to drop supposedly at level 50, right? And with trading, you can even trade it off. For example, if you get a very powerful rare that is a sacred item, which is a level 70 item, and even if you're still level 50, you can potentially sell off or trade off that valuable item if you don't necessarily need to use it yourself. But again, it would still be equipable by just a level 50 character because that's the level that you obtain it at. But it's just that the item power and the stats on it will be a lot higher relative to your current level. And so the same principle also applies to ancestral items, which are even higher level items likely meant for level 70 all the way to level 100 characters. And again, the way these work is that item power within this entire range can drop for any character that is already in the highest difficulty, which is again Torment. And I do think that this will likely be a fun feature because it sort of brings in even more excitement to the item hunt or magic find game, using an older Diablo term, in that even if the items, the sacred items or ancestral items that you find cannot be or are not optimal for your spec or cannot be used by your class, you can still get value from it if even just the rares that you can trade off to somebody else who might need it and get something actually useful in return. Now, I do think that this endgame progression system is decently compelling, especially considering that there's still a lot of other stuff, right? Like the Paragon boards, skill allocations, and other things or ways to modify your items, especially if respecialization isn't too prohibitive. And even if it is, people should still be incentivized to even have multiple types of gear to swap to, or even entire armor set swaps for different purposes, right? For instance, a player could have certain pieces of gear intended for PvP with a PvP spec, and also another one for, say, pushing nightmare dungeons, and yet another for general speed farming. And at first glance, especially perhaps with newer players to the Diablo franchise, the gearing system can seem pretty simple, especially with item power being a thing. But item power really only helps to determine the maximum numerical values that an item can get to, and doesn't really take into account the specific attributes that you might want for your specialization, right? And there are very specific ones that players would want for different classes and specializations, of course, and even playstyles. And not only that, but new to Diablo 4, and it's also something that many players have probably overlooked so far, and it's that specific item types actually also spawn with specific inherent characteristics. And this is even before any magic, rare, or legendary affixes are added. For example, axes always spawn with % damage to healthy enemies, and bows always come with % damage to distant enemies. Swords add critical strike damage, they always do. Wands add lucky hit chance, and so on and so forth. And so this definitely adds another layer of customization, choice, and even immersion, in my opinion, in that players will want to hunt for specific item types, weapon types, and offhand configurations for specific builds, or even vice versa, right? For instance, if they find a really powerful staff, which guarantees rolls with plus damage to crowd-controlled enemies, they might then be incentivized to incorporate more crowd control into their builds. By the way, when you look at a gear pieces tooltip, if it is an item that spawns with these inherent characteristics, and not all gear types will have this, but if it does, the differences are separated by this thin line on the tooltip. The ones above will be its inherent physical characteristics, whereas the ones below will be the magical affixes from it being a magic or rare or legendary item. And so coming back to the magical properties gained from rarity, you definitely want to roll to the highest number on a rare item before imbuing it with your ideal legendary aspect, right? Unless of course you're already rolling with some kind of godly unique item. And since rare or yellow items can roll up to 6 affixes, last we checked at least, you want to get that maximum number and also have the maximum number of affixes that actually suit or are good for your build. And then of course you want those up to 6 affixes to roll numerically as high as possible, right? So just these types of variables alone can make the best absolute top rare items quite rare indeed, and also valuable if, say, limited trade with rare items is actually going to be a thing. And this is actually somewhat similar to Diablo 2, where rare items can be, in some cases, the best items, again, for similar reasons, where if you get not only a high number of fixes, but also get ones that are actually very useful. But the difference is with Diablo 4 is that it also adds the playstyle shaping legendary aspects to the mix, and that you also want to find the highest rolled one for your specialization to imprint onto ideally the best rare item that you can find, especially since you can only use each legendary aspect once, at least those that are extracted from legendary items, right? And not the ones from the Codex of Power, which are going to be too weak for endgame in general anyway. And also for this specific system, another very interesting dimension to it is that not all legendary aspects can be used on all types of gear. There's actually different categories of them, being offensive, defensive, resource-based, utility, and then mobility, with each category having specific item slots that can qualify as imprint targets for them. And that's not even all, because two-handed weapons and amulets specifically, actually when they're imprinted, express increased power for that legendary aspect, making players want to perhaps imbue the most impactful or most powerful aspects on those two specific slots. Or in the case of the barbarian, he'll actually have two-handed weapons as candidates for this extremely increased legendary aspect power. And then when it comes to collecting the absolutely best rolled items, the occultist can take a bit of that pressure off by allowing for the reroll system or enchanting system, as Diablo 3 called it, by sort of being able to re-randomize one of the attributes on an item at a material cost. Now when it comes to acquiring these endgame items, they'll just generally have a chance to drop from you doing your usual farming and activities in higher difficulties. And more specifically, many of the endgame activities and drops start opening up at Nightmare difficulty, which is also referred to as World Tier 3. With Nightmare difficulty, first of all, unlocking the possibility for sacred and unique items to drop, and then also Nightmare sigils, which will be used to unseal your Nightmare dungeons. And this is also where Hell Tides, which provide increased rewards, can start to appear across Sanctuary. And then at Torment difficulty, which is World Tier 4, Ancestral items as well as even new unique items can start to drop. Next, there are also ways to target items for specific gear slots using the currencies you accrue. This seems to include the Whispers of the Dead bounty system, where you can select specific types of item caches. And of course, as well as the gambling system of Diablo 4, which involves collecting these obols, which is the currency from completing events in the open world. And next, even PvP seems to have this feature where the currency obtained can be redeemed, similar to gambling for specific gear slots. And next, during Hell Tides, which are again challenging timed events that spawn around Sanctuary, you can actually collect cinders during these Hell Tides to then unlock specific chests within these Hell Tide areas that'll each contain a specific type of gear that you can choose to spend your Hell Tide currency on. And it's also been confirmed that some sort of limited trading will indeed be possible, which should add yet another way for you to not only target specific pieces you need, but also allow you to sell or trade off potentially valuable pieces of gear that you don't necessarily need to use for your build or class. And lastly, Blizzard has stated that they plan to have specific monsters or specific zones or encounters have a higher chance at dropping specific types of loot, thus making the metagame, so to speak, a bit more interesting, where you'll be farming actually specific zones or dungeons for specific types of gear. Now, aside from just collecting the gear themselves, as well as the legendary aspects, there are also other ways that you can augment and upgrade and customize your gear through gems, socketing by adding more sockets, and upgrading your items through the blacksmith. So kind of similar to Diablo 3, not only will you be collecting a variety of gems, but you'll also be upgrading them with a gold cost through the jeweler. And in Diablo 4, there's also a way to add sockets to your items with a rare material called the Scattered Prism, which comes from world bosses as well as some other sources, I believe, such as treasure goblins. And I'm also glad to see that for Diablo 4, at least on paper and currently, it does seem like the gems are a lot more balanced compared to, say, Diablo 3, where people are just only using emeralds, for instance, in their weapons, right? For example, in Diablo 4, the emerald still adds critical strike damage, but this time only to vulnerable enemies. Whereas the Sapphire adds critical strike damage as well, but to crowd-controlled enemies. And some other gems include the Amethyst, which boosts damage over time, the Ruby that adds overpower damage, and so on and so forth. So each one seems to have a very specific niche, and thus are likely not only more balanced, but also offer a bit more choice and thinking that goes into this aspect of itemization. Next, we've also got upgrading gear with the Blacksmith, which isn't anything groundbreaking, and it's just slightly increasing the item power of a piece of gear, with rare items being upgradable 3 times, while legendaries get to be upgraded 4 times. And it's also quite worth noting that generally upgrading a weapon offers the best value, as it not only increases the numbers on the attributes on it, but also the weapon damage. And lastly, for yet another crafter to check up on and utilize even in the endgame, we have the Alchemist. First of all, she not only upgrades your healing potions even all the way to level 90, which is a very high level considering the level cap is 100, by providing her with materials, and as you get to the higher ranks of healing potions, mostly rare materials. Additionally, she also offers the option to craft elixirs of various sorts that are actually quite useful indeed, not only for the EXP boost, considering how important leveling up is to be able to collect more Paragon points, but also these elixirs actually can offer pretty decent combat buffs as well, such as increased overpower damage, increased attack speed, or increases to a certain elemental resistance, which can definitely become more important at higher difficulties, especially since your resistances get reduced by default in those difficulties, and for dealing with specific monster types or dungeons. And next, there's even yet one more unannounced and unrevealed perk from the Alchemist that we weren't able to unlock during the beta, called Incenses, which I speculate will probably be another form of a buff as well. And by the way, as yet another incentive to do a lot of the endgame events like Hell Tides and World Bosses, many of the rare materials required for especially higher end use in crafting, like the Fiend Rose here for enchanting legendary items, which is rerolling one of the attributes, is actually from Hell Tides exclusively. So that's pretty much all I want to cover today. Do let me know what you think about Diablo 4's endgame and progression systems in the comment section below, and I'll definitely try to reply to your comments. With that, like the video if you liked it, consider subscribing to my channel for more and cutting edge guides, and I will see you in the next video. Peace.